It's been a while since I've cared about reviewing live-action remake movies because they do not interest me nor the greater good in caring about. But as I realized in my half-baked Lion King remake review preparing for the worst in Mufasa, I thought I'd squeeze a bit back towards the bottom of the barrel here with what everyone can agree on to be the worst. I mean, personally, I still feel insulted by the Lion King and especially Mulan out of the most of my frustration, but there are movies that everyone can generally agree upon as absolute crap. Literally in this case with a film like Pinocchio, 2022's horrid mistake that remakes one of Disney's greatest classics that still live on today as a masterpiece of animation, storytelling, and making of the tunes that Disney is known for today when we wish upon a star to make sure our dreams do come true. Which, looking back upon this mistake 2 years later, is nothing short of baffling nonsense directed by the mind of Robert Zemeckis, starring Tom Hanks, who does not give a great performance at all. It never helped that they released this during the same year that Guillermo del Toro's own animated Pinocchio film that eventually won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, the one that respected the better art of form of animation being in stop motion, which del Toro did mention he liked the original Pinocchio growing up as a child and as an inspiration for its various elements of horror based upon the ills that the wooden boy had to avoid that started with the original novel itself, where it's just no point in really needing live action versions from the same damn company if half the entire world renders you to result in it needing visual effects to bring such characters to life. That part of this film is still based in the realm of CGI rather than reality, and that makes things a little harder to chew on knowing that it wants to be live action. We're just after Cinderella that mainly used real animals for the most part. Disney needed to adapt their more popular films that required real animal interactions to even work, which couldn't be possible unless done in the computer generated world. This problem is easily pointed out in the design of Figaro the cat and the damn fish Cleo and the weirdly strange close-up shots of Honest John. Lots of elements that makes it more jarring to the eye with the choices it makes and the mistakes of misunderstanding its original ideas, and how it's a sad state of affairs coming from the likes of Zemeckis, who never made a decent 21st century film after he brought us some of the classics from the 80s, just like Who Framed Roger Rabbit to Disney that also helped spur the entire Disney renaissance, but now contributed to the same year resulted in what I like to call the Disney slump, with Strange World released upon soon after to not great success at all, and what was 2023 before this new sequel era actually came in that I like to call that promises a better time in the upcoming potential of Moana 2. Where bringing that up, we also must remember that the original Moana is getting its live action officially released in 2026, almost 10 years from the original film, showing that nothing is safe and more needs to be said to mention how far they're willing to go for something that isn't as easy to make as much money as the Renaissance era films tried to show us. Which time will tell how well the other films like the Stitch live action will perform, as it uses creatures in the same CGI setting and hopefully with better results with its creator coming back to voice him amidst other things. And again, of course, Mufasa that also comes out later. But for the time being, let us focus back on these Disney Plus era live action films. Films that weren't considered worth Disney's time to release in theaters, as it wouldn't make them much money as what most would remember now, hence why the time gap between the original piece and the remake has shortened these days. Where even though such a film was more in development years prior to the launch of the service, the writing was on the wall with what they were officially bringing on board. This type of story is still somewhat unique for most movies today in the sense it's told in a sort of episodic nature with certain events that Pinocchio must face in his own journey from a wooden puppet to a real boy. That the original was described more as a morality tale, teaching young kids, both boy and girl, to learn to be better and avoid the evil temptations that the sinful world has to offer through various heinous individuals. Its success is rooted in the simplicity of a dream and how far it can take you in certain normal circumstances within the life of Geppetto. No royals, no superpowers, except for the power of life itself infused into a puppet. Of course, being an adaptation, it changes elements from its original novel, making Pinocchio a more likable figure than the devious puppet it was originally, which was great for something for its own design, but not for a remake under the same company that tries to do the same exact things. This version, like all others, tried to start a more thorough background, having Geppetto work on a puppet based upon his former son who passed away some time ago. Also how Jiminy Cricket was a homeless cricket until his future self told him off as the narrator, and whatever that beginning was supposed to be that is really bad compared to the original storybook opening that was hosted by himself. Also how we should point out that he's voiced by Joseph Gordon-Levitt in one of his weirdest voices I've ever seen him do, which is honestly hard to digest considering the last Disney voice role I know he did was Jim Hawkins from Treasure Planet that really fit his voice at the time, where something like this tries too hard to compare to the original Cliff Edwards performance of Jiminy Cricket. But the world of Tom Hanks' Geppetto is nothing short of depressing and confusing with a conflicting Italian accent at times. This man is written in a way where his grief cannot allow him to sell his clocks despite having an entire shop, where even though people would line up to buy them, all he can really say that it's complicated to the public.
But if you cannot sell your clocks, why do you have a shop?
It's complicated.
It's the first sign that you're not in for a good time if all things are justified in this manner. Well, technically, it's not like all of that of what I just said. It's more of the clocks are memories of his late wife, and he can't give up what his old family had, which is a problem we are discussing greatly in this video of they're adding a lot of information to the backstory of Geppetto with no real greater context to why it even works in the story. Like there's nothing to learn compared to the original that didn't really even need to include this information because it was all for leading up to his very wish of what he wanted in his life, instead of needlessly explaining what his entire background is. The more you do add something like this and add characters here and there, the more confusing it gets to be. Why would any of you think this is a good idea to include if you don't really explain that other than showing a montage of clocks tributing or glorifying Disney properties? It doesn't make sense because, you know, he has this entire shop making clocks, but he doesn't even think to sell them. Every element that's featured within the scene just seems more unnecessary the more you dive into each singular aspect. But as we all know, as the story goes, he wishes upon the star for something he cannot tell his cat, something very special and dear to his heart. And after they all fall asleep, a trail of blue dust and magic enters the room, striking Geppetto's pic of his son into the body of the puppet to bring him to life. A symbolic gesture that he had been infused with the life of the dead spirit that makes sense in what he misses, but also weirdly odd to actually think about and do if we really go back to the original. Because after he made this wish, the blue fairy did appear to thank Geppetto and grant him right then and there to make the boy alive and explain to him what's actually going on. Something as simple as can be for wishes come true. But here in this new modern film, we always like to take this strange extra step to introduce characters like the Blue Fairy, but making a comedic scene of Pinocchio waking up to the real world with Jiminy Cricket's surprise. And then she appears soon after, wanting to find the problem of where he is, where his head isn't quite right until she bobs him to fix what he was saying at the time and inquire about his name.
Sounds like your head is made of white pine, hence Pinocchio.
Oh my gosh, just end me already. Now as you can see, this was all done for the incessant explanation that all live action films like to do of tell and don't show. To explain to its audience every single nook and cranny of why things are the way that they are to differentiate and hopefully on their part understand that initial story a bit more. But again, such information is unnecessary and useless if you're able to pick up the original storyline of what was based on visual cues that overall shows you the world that you can tell for yourself. It's a mission to refresh the story, but makes the Rose more unimportant by how they continue to use her. It's a weird scene where she has to question things like, why would he wish for a real boy if he carved a puppet?
Well, if Geppetto wanted a real boy, why would he carve a puppet?
Making you think she hardly knows what she's doing compared to the original, who quickly got to the point and determined in order to make the wish a complete reality, he must prove himself to be brave, truthful, and unselfish, which the remake also does anyway too, but adds this extra step of wondering, why is he a puppet? Why doesn't he, you know, make his own real boy himself? Or, you know, whatever questions that might actually entail. Where as you can see in the presentation of ideals, the original is far superior and preferable in understanding the journey he has to take. The Blue Fairy came down from the wishing star to grant Geppetto's wish and make it so, and tell the extra steps to make it a reality on his part of the journey. To make Jiminy his conscience after telling him so that they get started without adding any bullcrap that hardly adds anything other than pointless runtime. Which at the very least I will applaud for only keeping it under 2 hours and about only 20 minutes longer than the original, including the credits in that scene, because honestly there really shouldn't be much to add on other than what it says for itself, Cinderella being a prime example for this with its own runtime, or other than to have the actress sing When You Wish Upon a Star before she leaves, which technically is supposed to be Jiminy's song since he sang it at the very beginning of the film and they had him do it in a little bit of the intro as far as I can tell, in the only instance of this version of the character singing, because they delegated it to the Blue Fairy because the actress is a singer in this scene before Geppetto wakes up. I mean, I don't exactly have to discuss this part because it runs like you normally would expect it to, apart from some different song choices. In the original, after the fairy left, Jiminy sings the song Give a Little Whistle, which is a reminder to ensure Pinocchio have him lead him toward the right path and what he can do as his conscience. But in this remake, we disclude that in song entirely because they don't trust Joseph Gordon-Levitt enough with singing that and instead continue to make Geppetto sing even more songs like Pinocchio, Pinocchio.
Pinocchio, Pinocchio, holy smoke-yo.
Yeah, they really thought this was a good lyric, huh? They replaced 4 songs from the original film with these new 4 songs, which unfortunately add nothing to the story and make things awkward and kooky as can be, other than to make sense of who actors can perform and whatnot. I don't think you need these new things if they don't actually move the needle to make what you love into doing something else. It just doesn't justify its entire existence if we know the journey from beginning to end. And this is where things start to get a little more interesting with Pinocchio's own task to go to school in the daytime, an introduction to the character of Honest John and Gideon, where they aren't really quite as bad looking CGI characters, but still cartoonishly weird to match its animated counterpart if you get what I mean. Once more, you have to give credit to the original for its animation at the time, where the character movements seem to be more real than what pretends to be real life. If you look at Honest John in the original, and of course the Blue Fairy when they rotoscoped real live actors, and that was actually a pretty great animation style on its own. Where nowadays, stuff like this just feels really crappy to be honest, especially when they make Pinocchio smell crap for some odd reason, despite being a puppet with no real nose. Like, I'm not sure what the hell Zemeckis or anyone on this team was thinking putting this in unless it's a subtle reference to how stinky such films like this really are, a subtle jab at Disney themselves for trying to make this. Because honestly, there's no real reason you should put this in unless you knew what was this served as an insult to the original that never even needed to put things like this, since it was never something he could do in terms of smelling as a wooden puppet with no nostrils up his nose. You know, I honestly think this is probably the moment that most critics realized that this film was not worth their time, either deciding it would be the worst reviewed live action film to date since it had no value justifying its existence otherwise. But at least Keegan-Michael Key gives a good performance as Honest John, even as they weirdly focus on his character for some odd reason, as to show off the actual animation they did for some odd character.
Why on earth would you want to be real when you can be famous?
The only animal that's worth showing off in terms of that, since they gave him proper facial animation compared to another franchise of creatures in a bland movie that should not be ever mentioned again. But also, what should not actually be mentioned ever again is how Pinocchio keeps freaking reminding people that he's made out of pine after John trips him.
I'm pine, that's why I'm called.
Really unnecessary. But before we get sidetracked on those thoughts, our story takes another turn from its twist of its main, where instead of Jiminy failing to convince Pinocchio against Honest John's wishes to become an actor, Pinocchio listens to Jiminy at first to go to school, where you start to notice his character is more righteous than his original naive counterpart that worked well because he acted like any young kid would, not knowing the goods about the rights and wrongs of the world, learning soon after of such consequences. But now how it's done in a way that makes him appear as a good boy who follows the rules until the rules kick him out since the teacher looked down upon puppets. That we take even more unnecessary detours to come up with ways to make someone who is already holier than thou betray the good path and go with the life of fame that was promised in the original with Stromboli and figures like Honest John. We just had to take this unnecessary step that the original film did not have to do because some reason live action films need to add something worth of value.
Puppies belong in the puppet show.
This puppet discrimination by the teacher is honestly very ridiculous, and the fact he says that they belong in the puppet show misunderstands everything about Pinocchio going towards John Stromboli in the first place. You might have the same song from the original with the actor's life for me and the same promises, and at least they keep the lyrics from the original, but you add something that ruins everything by making him literally go to school in the first place, the thing he was really supposed to do with Geppetto's wishes. So meeting up with Stromboli's appearance is where our newer characters get introduced, being puppeteer Fabiana and our puppet Sabina, one who has a sad yet unexplained backstory of an injured leg introduced to how she really feels about Stromboli's pathetic puppet show, where they do I've Got No Strings again, and then realize it's a moving show that tours place to place for his own desires of money. Again, trying to crush their dreams by locking them up inside the cage to tour the world, making him distrust real people apart from his own father. The point of just adding more scenes because you just can. This plays into the discussion he has with Fabiana, where he can't allow her to help him escape despite being a character who can get the keys but just has to send her puppet to speak of the only other person he could trust since Stromboli locked him up, but how she continues to talk along about this entire plan to get him to trust, where Stromboli comes back soon after to stop them from ever getting that damn key. Another useless addition that is a detour for doing the real scene with Jiminy, who finally gets to find him again and help him escape. Like, now you have to really wonder why they even had to include her as a character if she really couldn't help him since Stromboli came in back to remind him. Because I honestly have no idea, despite at least having an interesting character and story that they could have done on their own, but then turn it like everything else into utter unnecessary nonsense. And it's even more painful by how they get out of things since the key is just across the way, instead of making it harder for both characters to even find a way to get out, because Stromboli himself probably hid the key in his pocket from ever attempting to get out, since the point of the original was to make the Blue Fairy track their progress, wondering why he didn't go to school like Geppetto asked of him, who now worries about where he went. But this version has no involvement with her character anymore, leaving her opening as the only part of the remake's contribution to her entire idea for the story for some odd reason, and having Jiminy find a way to get him out with that very key. One where we see the infamous nose growing scene finally come into play, where he keeps telling lies and it only grows even longer, which of course was magic from the Blue Fairy to keep him in line when she tells him these very words.
A lie keeps growing and growing until it's as plain as the nose on your face. A boy who won't be good might just as well be made of wood.
It's a stark warning where he cannot allow himself to fall to the battled world unless he wants to remain a puppet for eternity, back into the state Geppetto created him with no life breathed into his body, that he only gets this one chance to redeem himself from this situation, as it relies on him to do the work to fully realize Geppetto's own wish, which he still has yet to do. He is a flawed character in all senses of the word, despite being so wooden, who is eager to learn about the world himself with careless optimism. But in the remake again, they didn't want to have that, with excluding her from this entire scene and having the key out there in the open where Pinocchio realized he could lie to Jiminy despite him telling him off. All for them to realize that they can get the damn key in this situation by having the nose, which Fabiana could have literally done seconds ago if this stupid wooden boy would have listened to her in the first place. But now it's all good after he apologizes about his lies and listens to Jiminy to help them escape, because that's how the movie is supposed to work for some odd reason. No lessons or grand consequences are needed because lies can get you out of situations easier than they can come back to bite you, like the original version said, never needing the Blue Fairy to tell him off in his mistakes in a situation that was hard to get out of, because the original Stromboli was actually smart enough not to put his damn key across the damn way. And now this journey moves forward, introducing us to the next villain being the coachman of Pleasure Island, where instead of the original having another scene having Honest John make a deal with him to get Pinocchio and the other boys to the island, he just gets caught up in his actual coach with the other boys dragged by donkeys, if that was ever so subtle to us all. They make so much weird choices in the film only to have other characters in one part rather than having shown them up in the other as more of the choices that should be made, and it really dampens his ability to be something very special, which is weird. Instead of, from before we added extra scenes that didn't even need to exist, they shortened this entire length with the conversation of Honest John and the coachman because they probably thought it couldn't have worked. Honest John in the original scene took the deal but also showed a great sense of fear of what might happen to the boys due to the coachman's scary nature of what he entails, only doing it for the money, growing deeper and darker the more you see it. But they cut all of that out, skipping to the part where Lampwick and Pinocchio meet for the first time, which I will also say I like this kid's performance as him too, matching the original energy. But all those facts are ruined when he gets to have his own song to perform, and the fact he's played by Luke Evans, whom most of us remember playing the live-action Gaston a few years prior, which I'm not a fan of because I see them as being more lazy with their casting choices in these films' overall output. I won't put him down as an actor, but I'm just saying that recasting them in different roles in its same genre of live action just seems so lazy to me. I could say something more about these songs, but I just can't because again, it just doesn't change how events play out. Yes, some song choices they have made for some films are great and interesting, but not all of them really add any greater value to an already told story. Instead, here we will focus on Pinocchio getting butchered yet again when he reaches Pleasure Island taking the boat ride with Lampwick. Instead of him taking pleasure like all the other boys on the island, he looks on with fear and disgust of all the other children trashing everything like they should. The weird holier-than-thou personality returning and continuing along as they drink some root beer instead of beer like the original for some sensitive reasons to protect kids, because that was totally the point of teaching people like the original about Pleasure Island, removing all the adult conveniences and themes of smoking cigars or drinking alcohol, since this Pinocchio is just too good-hearted of a character, better than the indulgent original one. I mean, dude doesn't even drink his root beer and only takes a whiff out of the top before Lampwick decides to drink one of his. Like, what am I supposed to learn here if he's not doing it himself? Why are you making him feel this way if he doesn't actually partake in this? That's the whole point of the original, making him drink and smoke and destroy because he's supposed to face the consequences of his naive nature and actions to really learn and instill amidst his kid audience about how bad it can be. Sure, it's weird that we look back on it today that they were smoking and saying some bad slang in past films, but it was very necessary when you get the overall theme that it was supposed to be bad overall. Another great issue I want to highlight is how they have both boys and girls in this party, something these live action films tend to do to be more inclusive of having them both, rather than one as highlighted by the next Disney Plus live action film Peter Pan that had the Lost Boys and Girls Club, which completely butchers the point if you understood the original works of each story, which means that girls were supposed to be better than boys to not actually get caught up in those lost areas. But at least for Pinocchio, we can be more lenient with that issue because it doesn't have to strictly be boys in terms of children who do not respect their own elders' authority or rules, but I figured in the original animated's point, it's more about how people like Pinocchio, the journey is supposed to be for him to become a good boy, which is hard for most of us to do, so coming to the vices of human nature disguised within the fun of life before it's too late. People don't learn by doing nothing, and he hardly does anything with his circumstance and still refuses to drink his last root beer out of all the things before he plays pool. We're like, where is the fun in that if he can't act out of good conscience without his own conscience in view? They also think they're just so funny censoring Jackass the moment Lampwick's donkey head pokes out, because you still gotta have that PG type of film despite being on Disney Plus, where they have opened up allowing more graphic content to be allowed. Not saying Pinocchio has to be graphic, but you know, if the original on Disney Plus can show us smoking cigars and drinking beer, then so can this one.
A jackass!
I mean, I know this is a minor issue, but they still attempted to hide all the bad things in a safe modern Disney wash way rather than its past attempted to showcase the horrors to its audience at the time that still rather remains timeless to all audiences itself compared to this one that nobody rather likes. I do find it interesting, however, how Pinocchio was going to turn into a wooden donkey by his tail compared to the actual one in the film, which thinking about it probably wasn't the best choice of understanding since he would have given up one life stuck as a puppet to another stuck as a real donkey, which would have been the worst fate since he was trying to attain real boy for himself. Also, having the coachman chasing Pinocchio after discovering him was probably also a better choice in the live action film since he was after all of them for labor and money and attempted to stop him as a villain should. Where after the scene they go back home to discover the shop empty as Geppetto sold all of his clocks just to search for Pinocchio near Pleasure Island. Our next difference here is the fact that Pinocchio got sent a letter by the Blue Fairy that he was swallowed by a whale compared to the seagull telling him that he was out on a boat to search for them. The sequence where he goes underwater to search for Monstro the whale, and how this one was more about him finding him out at sea, and more for them to reunite with Fabiana and Sabina of the behind the scenes events of what happened to Stromboli when he got arrested off screen. Lame to someone like me, where it's more about getting this happy ending for these entire characters who hardly have an important presence in the entire story, but just there for their puppet friend, which they accept as their right choice. I have to keep mentioning these things because of how immediately they removed his donkey portions when he decided to do the right thing.
I have to stay and find my father.
That immediately after he thought good thoughts about his father, it just goes away. But the reason why you should hate something like this with this magic is because his redemption comes with his own sacrifice later at the end of the film, and he hasn't actually earned that at all in this version, which stings to high heaven. Nothing he's done has proven when he gets back to Geppetto yet, and he shouldn't be actually returning to the same Pinocchio state we saw him at the very beginning. All it's for him to get back to Geppetto on the surface rather than below as a realization of consequences relaying back to his father about all the events that happened in the film if that was important. Because there's no reason for Geppetto to repeat everything he says. That's just redundant, making him only say things in the film to buffer some runtime, then already having him stuck down in the mouth of a whale that will come soon after rather than sneaking in. Like now, Monstro just just pops in right then and there in broad daylight to swallow both Pinocchio and Geppetto, which apparently Monstro the whale isn't exactly a whale for some reason, because I don't remember stuff like that being part of whales in the first place. So where even the original did not showcase things like that and actually conform to the fact he was a whale. Like honestly, what is with this film being so extra with all this nonsense? What point does it really add if Monstro looks like this or one character that is actually added? I know I've came up with reasons in the past and questioned every single step of the way, but I just can't find the courage to explain any stretch of this anymore. It just doesn't make sense to me. The only thing you can really say of what Monstro is where the wiki points out that he really is a sea monster of some type. What type? I do not know and I do not care, but I will still call him a whale because that is who he's supposed to be. This is where things get worse, where once they make their escape just like before, they make the original look more logical and realistic to life, where we find out that Pinocchio's wooden legs can motorboat all the way to shore faster than a damn sea monster whale. I mean, if you look at it, they try to escape by practical means, rowing the boat as fast as they can against Monstro, but how this one suddenly has legs of steel like he's a super powerful being made out of wood. Like now you get more and more that he's a Gary Stu type of character who gets unaffected by his environment, getting problems solved easily and morally doing the right things at first until those very things deemed good just didn't want him. But don't worry, that's not all, where they keep flipping the script, where instead of Geppetto waking up to see Pinocchio passed out and potentially dead, it's of course the other way around, confirming what I said earlier about his character even more. A moment of sadness for him that never works because this entire journey was about him making the play to become a real boy and the sacrifices it took to this point, hence his apparent death and everyone that was mourning for him on his bed. But now it's done for Geppetto, making him feel bad through this journey, doing bad things against his wishes as the only real thing that they could have been thinking of in this sense, reviving him with his own magically infused tear based upon his fact his spirit was energized from the picture of his dead son and the blue fairy. All for him to understand that he's brave and truthful, which makes him as real as they could ever be. Probably one of the worst endings to any Disney movie to date, with how things move and how Jiminy tries to bring us home, where instead of the blue fairy granting him a real body as he did demonstrate all the necessary skills required to be a real boy, we just get a more obscure picture. The question whether he became a real boy or not being more up for debate and vague as can be, with the dumb excuse of a cricket leaving off his personal feelings that he became a real boy as anyone could ever be.
People say he was transformed into an honest-to-goodness real boy. Did that actually happen? Who knows? But I do know one thing for sure. In his heart, Pinocchio is as real as any real boy could ever be.
Things that make no sense if he slowly turned into a real boy just before in that visual scene before they escape in the cave with some weirdly awful CGI monstrosity that was faced away from its audience. The whole damn point of this journey was for him to become a real boy, and they just straight up refused to show it at all. The happiness everyone felt to make the dream come true, rewarding Jiminy to become an official contest, as well as singing When You Wish Upon a Star for the final time to close out the ending that was well intended. Instead of that, you just tiptoe around that idea for an answer that just seems so vague that most are just really expecting. It is detestable to hide that fact from your audience and make it appear behind his actual face instead of the real earned transformation that didn't come. Or to have the words come out of the mouth of a cricket does not do any of those ideas justice. Why couldn't you actually have the real voice actor of Pinocchio actually show up in a real human form as reward for his own redemption? Pure despicable behavior on the part of the producers of this movie to even think this was what was good for a movie if they even had any shred of respect for what Pinocchio was and is to this very company, to what it was during Disney's foundational period of animated movies that we still cherish to this day. But I guess not, because that was not the intention of this movie, just to add content for some damn reason. Now this video may have been shorter than I expected, but that's because there really isn't much to say about this film other than it's a turd that most tend to forget fondly, only being remembered universally as the worst type of Disney film that the live action department had to offer in a period that started a questionable downturn and the viability of such concepts the more they produced them. More so than Snow White, Pinocchio, in its original form, represented the best of what Disney animation could have done, well remembered to this day for its very themes that inspired children to be the best that they could be for those who precede them in making wishes come true. There remains to be the prevalent theme for all of Disney to this very day, and how a Disney Plus remake never was on the cards for success, thrown away like a piece of trash like the fast food you just ate, which are what these types of movies are because they never seek to learn or advance any of the message that was first heard of. Nothing has came close to what Cinderella remotely provided that added to its original story rather than literally take things away in every single sense. With a bunch of performances I consider to be garbage from where they once were great in the heyday. What comes next in this slate will hopefully be better and not one of this depressing state, but still yet bad as it has yet to be proven. Nothing more than an exercise to watch as it does not prove its own worth to people wanting new stories. It's weird to say, but I am grateful this one got hated on the most for the errors these things provided, and hopefully the next generation can live without it now. There's nothing more to say now other than that I'm all done now. Goodbye.